No one ever knocked on Jonah Briggs' porch. Not even the mailman rode out that far. So when he heard the chains dragging across his wooden planks one night, he thought it was a ghost, or worse, the past coming back. But when he opened the door, there she was, a young woman, barefoot, trembling, wrapped in rags and rusted shackles. Her eyes searched his like she already knew him, and then, just above a whisper, she said, "Don't let them find me." Jonah didn't know her name, her story, or who they were, but one thing was clear. This girl hadn't come to the edge of the world by accident. Someone had sent her to the loneliest cowboy in the West, for a reason.
The wind moved like a whisper through the canyons that night, brushing past brittle sage and dancing across the wide plains that framed Jonah Briggs's land. His ranch sat so far from anything that maps forgot to name the dirt road leading to it. A single oil lantern flickered near the porch, its glow barely reaching the rails. The boards groaned under the weight of time, and the steps had warped from sun and storm alike. But inside, the silence was thicker than any darkness. Jonah was a man of few habits and fewer visitors. He lived alone with his horse, his tools, and the old rocking chair that creaked when the wind blew just right. Years ago, the house had seen more: music, laughter, the light feet of a child, but now it held only echoes, and those were quiet. He kept his rifle near the front door, more out of routine than fear. Out here, no one came uninvited, and nothing came by accident. But that night, the air shifted. A strange tension hummed through the dust, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. That's when he heard it, a metallic sound, irregular and hesitant, dragging over the wooden planks of his porch like a question not yet asked. He stood slowly, boots heavy on the floor, heart suddenly alert. The noise came again, clink, drag, clink. He stepped to the door without haste, but with purpose. The moment before he opened it felt endless, as if the world paused to watch, and then the door creaked open, revealing not danger, but something stranger. A girl, barely grown, caked in dust and shadows, stood at the threshold. Chains hung from her wrists, rusted and thick, and her dress was little more than a rag clinging to her bones. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and yet she looked at him as though she'd found the one place left on earth that could still hold safety. She didn't run. She didn't speak right away. Just breathed, shallow and sharp, as though her lungs were used to silence. And then she whispered something, so soft the wind might have carried it off before it landed, but it reached him. He knew it wasn't just fear in her voice. It was the end of something, and the desperate beginning of something else. He looked around, but the desert was empty. No rider in pursuit, no dust trail on the horizon, just her, just those eyes, and those chains that didn't look ceremonial or symbolic. They looked used, old, functional. He didn't ask questions. Not then. He moved aside, slowly. The girl didn't wait for permission. She stepped in like she already belonged to the quiet. Inside, the air shifted again, as if the house exhaled for the first time in years. Jonah didn't light another lamp. The shadows stayed deep. But something had begun, and it wasn't just the start of a mystery. It was the return of something he'd buried long ago, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to be alone forever.
The night passed without sleep. Jonah sat at the edge of the table, elbows on the worn wood, watching the faint silhouette of the girl as she curled up near the hearth. He hadn't lit a fire, didn't want the glow to call attention from whoever might be looking for her. The silence was thick, pulsing with unspoken questions. She hadn't said another word since she'd crossed his threshold, just held her wrist close, as if the metal still burned her skin. Her presence was too quiet for a fugitive, and too deliberate for someone lost. Jonah knew fear when he saw it, but this was something else. This was survival. By morning, the light creeping through the cracked windows revealed more. Her skin was marked not just by dirt, but by old bruises, some yellowed, some fresh. Around her ankle was a cuff, the chain broken but not cleanly. Whoever she'd run from hadn't intended to let her go. Jonah didn't ask. There was a code in men like him. Don't press a wound until it's ready. But in his gut, something stirred. Anger. Not the kind that exploded, but the slow, simmering sort that didn't forget. He went outside before the sun finished rising. The desert air was cool, brittle. He looked out across the landscape, hand over his brow, scanning the horizon. There was no dust trail, no hint of riders, no figures lurking in the rocks. But the silence still felt wrong, as if the land itself had seen what he hadn't. He saddled his horse, rode the outer fence lines, checked the markers, made sure nothing had been disturbed. Everything looked still. But instincts honed by solitude told him this wasn't over. When he returned, she was still asleep, if that's what it was. Her breathing was shallow, like someone trained to rest lightly. Jonah stepped into the house slowly, careful not to startle her. He placed bread and water on the table, then sat nearby and waited. Eventually, her eyes opened, and for the first time he saw them clearly. Brown, flecked with gold, and filled with too much history for someone so young. She ate quietly, every movement measured, as if every crumb might be her last. When she reached for the cup, her sleeve slipped, revealing the branded scar on her arm. Jonah didn't flinch, but the sight hit him hard. It wasn't the mark of a tribe. It was the mark of property. That day passed slowly. She didn't speak, he didn't push, but something settled between them, a fragile thread of trust, woven not from words, but from shared quiet. Jonah fixed the broken latch on the back window, sharpened his axe, fed the horses. She stayed inside, watching through the gaps in the wood. When the wind howled that afternoon, she moved closer to the wall, curling into herself, as if the wind had once brought danger. Jonah watched her from the porch as the sun dipped low again. She was more than what she seemed. Not just a girl in chains, not just a fugitive. There was intent in her silence, a fire beneath her stillness. And he knew without asking, whoever had hurt her would come looking. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when they did, they wouldn't find the same girl. Not anymore. The desert didn't forgive easily, but it remembered kindness, and so did Jonah. He'd lost too much to walk away now. That night he loaded his rifle, bolted the doors, and sat with his back to the window, staring into the dark, waiting, not with fear, but with purpose. She wasn't just in his house now. She was under his protection, and that changed everything.
The sun hung low behind the mountains when the girl finally spoke. It came not as a story, but as a whisper carried in fragments. Names she hadn't used in years, places that no longer existed, memories she couldn't leave behind. Jonah sat across from her at the table, not eating, not moving, only listening. The words came slowly, each one unwrapping pain she'd folded deep inside herself. Her name, she said, was Nessa. Her voice was light, almost apologetic, as though she didn't expect her name to matter anymore. She was born to an Apache mother who died when she was still small, and a white cavalry officer who vanished the day he was transferred. The tribe never claimed her. She was too pale. The white world never claimed her. She was too dark. She belonged nowhere. Raised among the fringes of both worlds, passed from hands that tolerated her to those who used her. Eventually, she became something to trade. One day it was for protection, the next for whiskey. The last time her father, drunk and trembling, had sold her for silver and silence. That was when the chains had come. Jonah said nothing. What could he say? There were no words strong enough to undo what she'd survived. But in the way he stayed still, in the way his hand rested near hers without touching, she felt something shift. She had been owned, caged, passed around like cattle. Now, for the first time, someone looked at her and saw a person. That evening, she moved freely through the cabin for the first time, not hiding in the corners, not flinching at every noise. She looked at the sky through the open window. For a long time, she just stood there, as if daring the clouds to bring a storm. Jonah watched her from the porch,
a faint ache in his chest he couldn't name. He didn't pity her. Pity was too soft. What he felt was older, heavier, like a stone lodged in the soul. When darkness settled, he added more wood to the fire. She sat near it now, her hands no longer clutching her elbows. The warmth touched her skin and her shoulders relaxed. She looked around the room differently, as though she were measuring the space not for escape, but for belonging. That night, as Jonah lay in bed, he didn't sleep. He replayed her story in pieces, imagined the men who had hurt her, the places that broke her, the silence that followed. And slowly, quietly, something settled in his mind. He would not let anyone take her again, not while he breathed. Outside, the desert wind rolled across the earth, brushing past the windows like a whisper of what was to come. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, there was a feeling Jonah hadn't known since his wife died. Something close to purpose.
The wind carried dust through the wooden ribs of the town, brushing sand along doorways and creaking the sign above the general store. Jonah stepped off his horse in front of the saloon, boots touching ground like stones dropped into a still pond. He hadn't been in town in weeks, and now he walked like a man with no business to spare, eyes quiet, face unreadable. But under the brim of his hat, his jaw was tight. He had seen them from the ridge before dawn, 3 riders, slow-moving, but sure of where they were going. One of them carried something rolled in leather on his saddle horn. Another had the walk of a bounty hunter, too relaxed, too observant. Their horses were dusted in red clay, not local. They didn't belong. And Jonah knew that men like that didn't ride into nowhere unless they were following something, or someone. Inside the saloon, heat and whiskey mixed with low voices. The piano sat silent. Jonah pushed through the door and nodded to no one. He walked to the bar, ordered a drink he wouldn't touch, and let his ears do the work. The 3 strangers stood near the back, one with a scarred cheek, another missing 2 fingers. They weren't drinking either. They were asking questions. The bartender, old Will, glanced nervously as Jonah stepped near. Their eyes met. Jonah didn't speak. He didn't need to. Will only gave the faintest of nods, a silent warning. The man asked about trades, about cattle. Then one of them mentioned a girl. Quiet voice, but the word cut sharp. Said she might have been seen heading west, maybe with a man, maybe not. The tone was too casual, too rehearsed. Jonah didn't react. He turned his body slightly away, like someone who was done with his drink, like a man with nothing left to hear. But inside something dark bloomed, a pressure behind his ribs, behind the bones that still remembered what it meant to lose everything. He left without a word. The horse stirred beneath him like it felt his mood. The road home stretched like an old scar across the land, and as he rode, he thought of her, not just the girl who showed up in chains, but the one who had stood by the fire last night, unguarded for the first time. He thought of her eyes, no longer clouded in fear, and he understood what it would mean if they came for her. He couldn't bring her to town, couldn't trust the law, not when money changed hands faster than bullets. If they came to the cabin, he'd have to make a choice, but deep down, he already had. Back at the ranch, the girl was out feeding the chickens, barefoot in the dust, sleeves rolled high, hair braided. She looked up as he rode in, and for a split second, he thought about telling her, warning her, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he looked out at the hills, at the rising dust behind the horizon, and whispered a promise only the wind could hear. Let them come. He was ready.
The days that followed were slow, quiet, and thick with unspoken tension. The girl no longer flinched at the sound of boots on wood or the creak of the barn door, but her eyes darted like a wild doe's whenever a distant noise echoed from the canyon. The cowboy, who had long ago gotten used to the solitude of his land, now found his world reshaped by her presence. He kept his rifle closer. He scanned the horizon more often. Something about her silence carried weight, as if danger had a name she was too afraid to speak. The ranch, usually a space of peace and weathered labor, grew heavy with anticipation.
Each morning, the cowboy would rise before dawn and check the ridges, saddle his horse, just in case, and ride out further than necessary, pretending to inspect fences, when in truth he was searching for signs. A broken branch, a strange boot print, smoke that didn't belong to his chimney. And each time he returned, her eyes searched his for news, though neither of them ever asked. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the far hills, turning the desert gold, she stood at the edge of the corral watching the horses with a kind of longing in her gaze. He watched her from the porch, arms crossed over his chest, unsure whether he should approach or keep his distance. She was changing, less frightened now, more like someone remembering who she used to be. But even as her steps grew steadier, the shadows under her eyes remained. That night, a strange silence blanketed the land. The wind didn't blow, the crickets stopped singing. The cowboy stepped out from the cabin and looked at the sky. Stars blinked above like watchful eyes, and the moon was thin as a blade. He felt it before he heard it, that cold, ancient stillness that said someone else was near. He returned to the house and loaded his rifle quietly. She was already standing by the door, wrapped in a blanket, her bare feet pale against the wood. She said nothing, but he saw it in her face. The moment she had feared had come. They didn't sleep that night. She sat curled in the corner, arms around her knees, while he sat in a chair facing the door, the rifle across his lap. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was something else, something deeper. He didn't understand it, not fully, but it was there, a duty that had nothing to do with law or pride, just one human refusing to let another be hunted. Dawn came slow and heavy, spilling light over the dust like it had to fight its way through the weight of the night. And then came the knock. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. 3 steady raps that made the girl freeze like stone. The cowboy stood, heart steady, and opened the door. Outside, 2 men stood in dust-covered coats, neither local, their boots too clean for real trail work, their horses were too quiet, their smiles were too practiced, and their eyes didn't blink when they said they were looking for someone. A girl. Said she was dangerous. The cowboy said he hadn't seen anyone, voice flat. The men looked past him. One of them stepped forward but stopped when the barrel of the rifle tilted ever so slightly. Tension cracked the air, then the taller one smiled, tipped his hat, and said they must have been mistaken. When the door closed, the cowboy didn't move for a long time, and from the shadows, the girl finally breathed.
The morning air was still and thick with the residue of what had nearly been. The girl sat on the porch steps, wrapped in his old duster, her hair damp from washing, her eyes watching the sunrise, like someone trying to remember what hope felt like. The cowboy poured coffee in silence, then handed her the mug without a word. She took it with both hands and nodded. He sat beside her, boots on the dirt, hat resting on one knee. For a long time, they watched the horizon burn gold without speaking. Then she told him everything. Her voice was low and careful, each word pulled from deep inside like it had been buried for years. She was not just a runaway or a stolen girl. She was born of 2 worlds, her mother an Apache healer, her father a white scout who never claimed her. The tribe never fully accepted her, and the settlers feared her blood. She lived most of her life moving between shadows, until one night a band of traders raided a camp where she was hiding. They sold her to a drunk who called himself her guardian. When he learned of her mixed blood and saw no profit in her silence, he tried to rid himself of her. That's when the chains came. But there was more. Carved into the iron was a mark, a sacred one. Her mother's tribe had branded her with a symbol not a shame, but a protection. The spiritual seal meant to guard the innocent, to carry warning. The men who hunted her weren't seeking a criminal. They were trying to erase a witness. The cowboy listened without interruption, hands clenched tight around his coffee. When she finished, she looked at him for the first time with steady eyes, no longer afraid to be seen. He didn't ask her what she wanted. He didn't need to. By now, it was clear. The danger wouldn't vanish just because they shut the door. Something inside him had shifted, no longer the cautious loner, but a man who had something worth standing for. By midday, he hitched his strongest mare to the wagon, loaded it with supplies, and handed her a rifle, not as a threat, but as a promise. She held it like someone who'd held one before. They left the ranch behind in silence, taking the southern trail, the one few dared to ride without escort. They moved slow but sure, heading toward a ridge where the girl believed her mother's people might still shelter, or at least where stories like hers were still heard. As they rode, a storm gathered far behind them, thick clouds rolling like smoke across the plains. But in front of them, the land opened wide and bright, the kind of sky that felt like it belonged to someone starting over. And though they spoke little, there was an understanding between them now. Not just safety, not just survival, but choice. He had chosen to shelter her when he could have turned her away. She had chosen to trust him when the world gave her no reason to. By the time night fell, they had crossed into land no lawman rode without fear, but the cowboy didn't look back. He'd made peace with the trail behind him, and whatever lay ahead, he would ride toward it, not as a man escaping, but as a man finally belonging somewhere, even if it was beside a girl the world had tried to forget.